So today we will talk about Confucius, the subversive Confucius. There is something subversive about the idea of goodness, both with Socrates and Confucius. And by raising the idea of the absolute good, Socrates, for his part, was criticizing the customary values of Athenian citizens of great wealth and standing. He was saying, we know what you do and what you value, but we reject it. There is something higher and better. So he was seen as politically and socially subversive in raising these questions, and thus he found himself condemned to death by suicide by the Athenian court. We don't know quite as much about the life of Confucius, but we do know that he travelled as a teacher, moved from state to state, and was considered for high administrative office. But it's clear from the Analects that there was a similar subversive element to the idea of Ren, humaneness. When we think about it, there is something subversive about raising the idea of goodness, as it confronts and it contrasts with the actual state of affairs, the actual behaviour of the society surrounding the individual. It sounds a critique, and also it offers a rebuke. And this is the case whether or not you believe in a sovereign good, like Socrates, goodness in itself, as he said, or whether you believe in goodness expressed in 1,000 different types of behaviours in 1,000 situations, like Confucius. It is still an uncompromising idea, an idea which is subversive in a context of decay and self-indulgence. Confucianism has been endorsed by the present regime in China. In 2013, Xi Jinping was the first chairman in the history of the Communist Party to visit a Confucian temple, which he did at Chufu, which you see displayed behind me, the birthplace of Confucius, and now a centre of Confucius-related tourism. And he gave a speech praising Confucianism. Then in 2017, the Communist Party of China Central Committee and the State Council jointly issued a statement on the promotion of traditional culture, traditional Chinese culture, that is, traditional Chinese cultural excellence. And this announced a series of government initiatives to promote Chinese culture and Confucianism. So Confucianism was now held to be a symbol of Chinese excellence. This is an extraordinary development, given the way in which the Chinese Revolution under Mao Zedong rejected the Confucian Way. The Red Guards chanted about Confucius the hooligan, and they pulled down his statue. One thing about human history is that statues go up and they come down. But among other things, Mao complained that Confucianism contributed to the subjugation of women and perpetuated it. And I will turn to the question of women later in this series. The question is the complete absence of women in the Analects and what we say about it, and later the two female Confucians who created a female version. I myself visited the International Confucian Association in Beijing about 15 years ago to present a book on the Confucian tradition by my colleague Martin Liu. And I had there a long discussion on whether Confucianism or Marxism was the dominant influence in the modern Chinese state. Minutes of the discussion were taken down in elegantly drawn Chinese characters in a large book. And there was much courtesy, and it was a very interesting discussion. But then, at that time, it was clear that the Confucian Association was somewhat on the outer and functioned more or less independently of the Chinese government, who were not hostile, but equally not interested. The Confucian Association was tolerated. Everything changed with Hu Jintao, who began to talk about harmony, very much in Confucian terms, without mentioning any sources or without endorsing Confucius. And he talked about harmony both internally, socially, but also internationally, within the nations. And then came Xi Jinping and the complete re-endorsement of Confucianism, along with the encouragement of tourist attractions, such as Confucian-based theme parks. I recall about 3 years ago, a colleague at a university in Beijing, a senior professor, giving me a lift back to my hotel, and during this conversation he said, "There's now a huge renaissance of Confucianism going on in China." He said it is like the European Renaissance in the 16th century, of course, and he predicted that it would spread internationally and sweep all before it, like the European Renaissance in its time, and the way in which it swept all across Europe. And there's no doubt that there is a huge revival of interest in Confucianism in China itself. And in the USA, there can be found revivals of Confucianism in places like Boston, and in some of California's Christian churches, which synthesize Confucian teaching and Christian teaching into a combination which satisfies Christians who also have a strong Confucian cultural background. Whether this will go further, this revival of Confucianism will go further in the West, as predicted by my friend and colleague, we'll see. It may be limited to the Chinese diaspora. Will Confucianism survive its endorsement by the Chinese state and by the Communist Party? That's an interesting question. It may well do so, because there are many aspects of Confucius philosophy which match the agenda of the Communist Party, as it now is. The pursuit of corruption, the authoritarian respect for an authoritarian regime, the need for social benefits to accrue for all, to take just some examples. But Confucianism may change because of the embrace of the state. Christianity thrived under the Roman Empire because it was persecuted. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That was the famous expression of Tertullian, the Latin writer. But when it finally became the state religion, Christianity did indeed further flourish. The state did not kill it, but it did change significantly, and many would argue for the worse. So we will see how Confucianism and the Communist Party, going hand in hand, will work out. The role of the real Confucius was to speak truth to power and interpret the Chinese way in the most ideal form. Not that he looks for the essential transcendent thing, as the Greeks would do, but he looks for the way in the light of all the factors governing the behaviour of the good person and the different situations that he or she finds himself or herself in. But Confucius is tough. He simply rejects compromise and inadequacy. He may sometimes be obscure about the way, but he rejects compromise. He says, in striving to be humane in your conduct, don't yield even to your teacher. And he also says in 1539, that was 1536, there is no such thing as social classes. So far as education is concerned, society is classless. In addition, we may aspire to be better even than our teacher. It's the goal itself which counts, not the position of someone above us. There's an incipient insubordination in this. He asks us to keep our eye upon humaneness above all, regardless of who is in authority over us, even one who purports to be teaching us. Whilst it is customary to regard Confucius as an exponent of tradition, we should not neglect the idea that he was revolutionary in his time and attracted a great deal of attention because his views were challenging, not because they were easy. The idea that we must be better than our teachers, or at least that we must not bend from our own standards, even if they are attacked in some way, this is not an easy principle, nor is it one of slavish obedience. It is an ethic of obedience to a higher calling, the ethic of letting one's standards be the best standards, irrespective of what is around you. Confucius' own claims to be a traditionalist should not fool us. That is a way of masking his challenge to the status quo. A rebel Jew, let's say Jesus, would appeal to the prophets as his forerunners, which he did. The radical exponent of goodness in Athens, Socrates, also stressed his loyalty to Greek mythical tradition. So Confucius claimed to be a traditionalist. His claim not to be innovating should be seen more as a defensive cover, intended to disarm criticism. He was every bit as radical as the other two I mentioned. Apparently fearless in criticism, Confucius could have alienated many. In Analects 3:1, he complains of the G family that they use 8 rows of 8 dancers each to perform in their courtyard. If this can be tolerated, he says, what cannot be tolerated? The commentators suggest that this level of display, the 8 rows of dancers, 8 deep, was an imperial privilege only, and that therefore the G family was getting beyond its status. But one can also see in this a critique of conspicuous consumption, a critique of flashiness, which would sit uneasily with the need to bring harmony into society. Confucius insists on moderation at all times. The critique is direct and clear, though again Confucius expresses himself with a negative. What may not be tolerated, if even this is tolerated? The knot opens up a great field of possibilities, and one can imagine the anarchy which might result if this kind of ostentatious extravagance were to be generalized into society at large and at all levels. Again, it is the knot which tells the story. Underlying this condemnation is the view that Confucius has of politics and the management of society, which places a great deal of emphasis on the sharing of privilege and the bringing of harmony via moderate behaviour. This raises the question of leadership in Confucius, the top-down issue, which we'll address in another discussion. Thanks for coming along with me, and next time I'll talk about a moral dilemma concerning two young men who both denounced their fathers to the law.